It's interesting to hear you use the phrase postmodern left, because I think the way in which that phrase is most commonly received today is actually with a right wing meaning, a figure on the right today, such as Jordan Peterson, uses actually a very similar critique to that which could be found in your book from the early 90s, I think, on postmodernism, Perry Anderson's, Frederick Jameson's, this Marxist diagnosis of postmodernism, which on the left, the argument that you made and others made was that postmodernism was providing a sort of retreat for a left which had become institutionally helpless and weak, and was therefore sort of escaping into a kind of coping delusion. The right-wing version of that is that the left cunningly transformed themselves into postmodernists and therefore took over the entire culture. I wondered, though, that right-wing kind of appropriation aside, I wondered what you made of the recent sort of left populist experiment of Corbyn, Bernie Sanders, Podemos, Syriza, which we're now on the other side of. But when that was happening, did you see that as a kind of breaking out of that postmodern trap that you'd witnessed the left back itself into?
I did, and I still do in many ways, I think. I mean, I don't necessarily think those energies are exhausted. They've taken a battering, but there's still an enormous amount of goodwill behind that, good intentions. One of the points about postmodernism, I think, relevant there perhaps, is the transition to an overemphasis on culture. I certainly see that as part of the left's political deadlock. To a certain extent, when the left kept running its head against problems it couldn't really tackle, because the system itself was in a much more aggressive posture, particularly from the late 70s onwards, certainly during the 80s, with the kind of squalidly and openly acquisitive culture, Thatcher and so on. In that situation, culture became, in one sense, a deepening of traditional left concerns. In another sense, it became overemphasized, and a certain postmodern ideology you might call culturalism, began to emerge, which acted, as I say, as a sort of displacement of political issues. Obviously, culture is highly politicized, but I think it was a sign of a certain defeatism that the discourse became so much about culture and so little in the traditional left sense about, economy or the state or class conflict. One example of that, I suppose, would be the post-colonialism which arose at the time, which really, on the whole, with some very honourable exceptions, no longer spoke about the so-called developing world in terms of state and trade and imperialism and economy, but talked about hybridity and identity and plurality and language and so on. All of those concepts are very significant and vital, but I think that a materialist critique was what was really lost. As for the point about the right-wing appropriation, yes, I think, one point I suppose to make is that there are bound to be, embarrassingly, areas in which the right and left overlap, in which they share. For example, if one looks at high modernism, it largely launched from the political right, from indeed darkly reactionary perspective in many ways, but often tremendously full of insight about liberal capitalism from the right wing, and in the absence of a concerted left-wing critique there. So I think one has to recognize that there are, to that extent, overlaps. I mean, conservatives don't like postmodernism, and neither do I, but for very different reasons.